got a few coming in. 495, if you want to go ahead and mark in your hymn books there. 495 will be the song that we're going to sing here in just a moment. Brother Barry's going to lead us in that. And I'll ask, Brother Tom, would you care to word our prayer for us when he's done with the song, please? Tommy Turner. No, I'm sorry, no, Tommy, not Tony. I can see the confusion, I can, all right. All right.
495, first and last verses. For the depth and the riches of God's saving grace, flowing down from the cross for me.
We'll be opening your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians 6. Second Corinthians 6. We're ready to pick up with verse 14, and I gave you, we talked just a little bit about unequally yoked last week, but I said we would go back and talk a little bit further in verse 14. And then I also gave you a key word I wanted you to look up, Belial, and see what you could find on that. And we'll talk about that as we get into verse 15 in just a moment. But some of the things that Paul's been addressing there in the church in Corinth is he has really more or less pleading with them to open their hearts and to hear the truth and to follow that truth, to believe that truth and so on. And so he's really been pleading with them, especially in verses 11 through 13. He says, "O Corinthians, we've spoken openly to you. Our heart is wide open. You're not restricted by us, but you're restricted by your own affections. Now, in return for the same, I speak as to children, you also be open." So he's saying the heart problem, the heart condition you're having right now, the rejection of the gospel, your choice, not to live appropriately among the Christians the way that you're supposed to, the proper example and so on. He said, all these things. He said, it's not because we bound you up. We gave you the truth. It was a matter of you taking that truth and doing right with it. He said, we've not bound you. He said, you've been bound by your own, he says, affections, right? So the things that they want to do. what sounds good to them, their worldly things, right? And the things that you have affection for, the things that you care about the most. So the point is, they were caring more about worldly things than they were about Christ. And so that was a problem. And he's pleading with them, "Oh, Corinthians, open your hearts. Be receiving of this gospel." And then verse 14, where we're going to start here this morning, he makes an interesting statement after having just pleaded with them to open their hearts and to be receptive, to hear the gospel, to follow the gospel, to do all these things that is required or called for them to do. And then he starts giving them, in a sense, some warning, but also essentially reminding them of this is how you do not need to be or behave or react and so on. So look at verse 14 as we begin this morning. He says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers." He said, "For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness?" So the first part of this, and we talked about it just briefly last week, and I think I kind of put Tim on the spot just a little bit last week. I won't do that to him again this morning. But we talked about this. Do not be unequally yoked together. Well, I tell you what, let's stop it right here. Do not be unequally yoked. Let's stop it right there for just a moment. This command, which is Paul's main point, I believe, for really this whole section from verse 14 all the way actually to chapter 7, verse 1 will be restated in different words at the end of the section in 7 and verse 1. But he focuses on this subject for just a moment because he says do not be, or to be unequally yoked. Well, what does that mean? Now, we talked about last week about hitching up an ox and a mule together, right? And this yoking, the yoke was actually an instrument that was used to put over the necks. In fact, you can still see some yokes today, especially if you go to, where they're having, I don't know, you'll see some of the antique trailers or wagons and so on, and they yoke the horses down, or mules that pull the wagons and stuff. But anyway, you'll see them in parades a lot. But this yoke could be something that extends down to cover 2 animals, 4 animals, so on. And the object is you put them in there together to work how? Well, the point is to work as a team, right? And this team has to believe together. They have to step together. They have to pull together. They have to resist together. And they have to know and to understand this. And if you yoke up 2 different animals together, then they do not understand the same thing, right? They're believing one thing and believing another. And so therefore, the one will pull more than the other. One may resist more than the other. One may step wider or different than the other. And the problem is you're not going to make it very far, okay? If you have a 20-mile journey, you might get 2 miles and you're finally just going to stop and take one of them off and hope the one that's left can do it, right? That's the problem. He says, don't yoke them up. He said, do not be unequally yoked. Now, here's what is, I think, important, this hitching up or so on. And he makes a point, too, and I think it kind of speaks to this as well. It's good to mention. I'll read a couple of verses for you. This, for the Jews, also was the crossbreeding, right? And in Leviticus 19 and verse 19, he says, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another livestock or another kind. You shall not sow your field with mixed seed. You shall, nor shall a garment or mixed linen and wool come upon you, and so on. But then there's a statement that's made later on in Deuteronomy chapter 22 and verse 10. It says, you shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. So that's essentially saying the same thing as what's being mentioned here. So I think what we have to point out is, what exactly is Paul talking about? Is he literally talking about, a mule and an ox? He's making an illustration that would lend to their understanding or their knowledge, right? Something that they would be familiar with, because the majority of people farmed. They did. That's how they survived. And so on, whether it was in trading goods or selling in the market or survival. They farmed. That's what they did. And so this would have been something they would have been familiar with, or even the people of the city would have understood the concept. right? They get the point. And then especially when you think about comparing it to, Levitical law, going back to the law of Moses and so on, they should have understood this concept. But he says, notice this, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So Paul answers it. He's talking about what's in the yoke. Well, it's not an ox and a mule. It's a believer and an unbeliever. It's a Christian and a non-Christian. He said you can't yoke them together. He said it'll be a constant what? It's going to be a constant struggle, right? It's a constant battle. It's this constant battle between the two. Do not be yoked with them. Now, one thing that I think would be important to note here too is more often than not, the unbeliever is going to lead the believer astray or off the path or something along those lines, right? Because of the nature of the flesh. So what is the overall point? It's an image for being allied or identified wrongly with unbelievers. In fact, its context itself refers especially to those who are still rebelling against Paul within the church. Now, something else that's good to note, 2 Corinthians 13. Which is way ahead, I know, but Paul makes a distinction there, and I think it relates very, very much relates to what we're talking about here. In 2 Corinthians 13, we'll see the context. It refers, Paul now shockingly labels unbelievers. In fact, look ahead there at 2 Corinthians and see what he says. Somebody turn there. Somebody who wants to read that for me. Get you involved a little bit this morning. I'm doing all the talking. Who wants to read it? Show a hand. Wow, I'm going to have to break y'all in. I'm going to break you in right. We're going to do it. Who wants to read it? 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5. 13, verse 5. Who wants to read it? I'm going to get you involved. All right, Alan, thank you for not leaving me hanging there. Man. All right. 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5. So I think Paul here clearly thinks it is possible that some in Corinth are in this state. I think he kind of alludes to that in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, that there is a problem. I think it connects right back here to verse 14, that he's telling them this because, hey, all right, I've told you to stop restricting by your affections and your desires, stop restricting opening your heart. And he says, I tell you, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So clearly, and then with what he mentions in 2 Corinthians 13, there's obviously an issue. There's a problem there. And I think Paul hopes that that's not the problem, but I do believe that is an issue that he's having to address because they're getting more and more involved with unbelievers. And of course, we've noted too in the past, talking about, some of the territorial issues, some of the issues within the city. What was a big problem at Corinth? Don't be specific, you can be broad. What was a big problem in Corinth? Idolatry, all right. What else? Anyone else? Immorality, all right. Those are some really good broad terms. Why was that a constant struggle there? Now just think about the state of the city, its location, some of the things that were going on there. Why was that a constant problem? Yeah. It's a port city, that's right. In fact, it was shared on, I believe, 3 sides, if I'm not badly mistaken. It had 3 major ports there, and it was a constant people of all beliefs and ideas, which to me, you would think, okay, this is a great mission field. Wouldn't you think this would be a wonderful mission field? But you've got people coming in there in every form and type of pagan belief. You've got them coming in and out, constant. You have prostitutes and alcoholism and all kinds of other things that are a constant battle, constant struggle within this seaport. And so for the Corinthians, they were having a hard time. Now, I'm not making excuses for them. I'm just saying this constantly being yoked with unbelievers was a problem because they constantly faced it. This was a daily struggle. And so Paul is trying to encourage them to come back to the truth. He says, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? Well, there is none. There is no fellowship. What is righteousness? What is righteousness? Do what? Yeah, in a sense, right? It's living in a manner which God approves, right? Yeah, that's righteousness. All right, so what is then lawlessness? The opposite of following the law, right? Yeah, it's everything opposite of that. Well, there again, that you cannot bind righteousness and lawlessness together. You can't yoke them together because they do not work. All right, the same principle with light and darkness. Notice what he says. He says, and what communion has light with darkness? What is the purpose of darkness? Darkness hides their sins, right? Light exposes that lawlessness. It exposes that sin. So for one to live in righteousness means they have to live in the light, and therefore there is no darkness in the light. So these are just some things to think about. Paul is trying to relate this in a way that should cause them to understand where they're falling short. All right, so 2 Corinthians 6, verse 15. Let's go ahead, we'll look at this next verse. Verse 15, it says, and what accord has Christ with Belial, or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? Okay, so Paul continues this thought in verse 15, but I wanted to take just a moment and kind of point out for just a minute what he's talking about with Belial. I don't want this to be confused. I know some may try to render this term in a certain way, and we need to understand what it really means, its concept, or where it comes from. Okay, all right. Yeah, worthlessness, all right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're in ESV, aren't you? ASV, okay. Because the New King James, and I'm not sure, I think the King James as well, neither one of them, this is the only time they actually render Belial, or how'd you pronounce it? Belial, all right. Hey, I'll go with it, sounds good. I'm not gonna argue with somebody on pronunciation. I will say this, it comes from the Greek word Beliar, but no, that's fine. This is the only time you actually see that word. But its original Hebrew form, or even in the Greek, you'll find this same Beliar, Greek, that's the Greek, you'll find that same word actually used in multiple ways as well. Just like you said, wicked one, is that what you said? Wicked woman, okay, all right. Same thing, worthlessness, right? There's a couple other renderings. Judges 19, verse 22. Judges 19, verse 22. You can go ahead and turn there. Judges 19, 22. Judges 19, 22. Hold your place there. And then you're going to 1 Kings 21. 1 Kings 21. I'll just show you a couple of ideas here. In Judges 19, when you get there, verse 22. Now, I want to point out here, it's not a name that's actually specific. You'll hear some will call Satan this name. This is actually not a name for Satan. It's not. Now, where a person may argue, and this is where we can really, I think, find some common ground, is because it's actually rendering a characteristic of Satan. So therefore, it's not really a name that you would render him that name, but being one of his characteristics, because there are many characteristics of Satan, right? There are. you'll see it rendered in many different terms. All right, Judges 19:22, as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, notice this word, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house, that he may know him carnally. So that word perverted comes from the same Greek Hebrew word as the Belial, or however you want, Belial, or however you want to pronounce it. But it comes from that same word and is actually defined as worthlessness. All right, another example, looking at 1 Kings, you should have your place there marked, 1 Kings 21. Go ahead and look at verse 13, 1 Kings 21:13, verse 13. Notice what he says there in verse 13. He says, and two men, I'll wait till the pages stop. I'm sorry. Some of y'all are trying to get there. I want to give you time and be patient. I apologize if I get a little excited. All right. 1 Kings 21:13. You're almost there. All right. So looking at 1 Kings 21:13, notice the words he uses there. And two men, scoundrels, came in and sat before him, and the scoundrels witnessed against him, against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth has blasphemed God and the king. Then they took him outside the city and stoned him with stones so that he died. So the word there is obviously scoundrels. All right, that's a term, that I've used it today. Call someone a scoundrel, right? Meaning it is a worthlessness. They carry about them a worthlessness. Well, that scoundrel, that perverted, that wickedness, all right, those are characteristics of Satan. No, I just wouldn't want you to run around just rendering him Belial, but I wouldn't fall out with you if you did. Just know that that's actually a characteristic of Satan. It's not the name Satan himself. All right, so let's keep on moving here as we continue on with, let's look at the last part real quick. He says, again, affirming what we looked at in verse 14, he says, or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? Again, making that same comparison, Paul's saying a believer has no part with an unbeliever. In fact, the unbeliever is going to lead the believer astray. And so you have to be careful about that. So verse 16, he says this, he says, in what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. And God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now let's look at the first part of this. Look at the first part of this. He says, and I'm going to cut it right here on purpose because I just want to show you something. Well, my pen went down. Here we go. In the first part of this verse right here, right there. Idols, question mark. He says, for you are the temple of the living God. So this is the area I want you to focus on here. All right, see that? Idols, for you are the temple of the living God. I want you to focus on that for a moment. Now, Romans 1 and verse 23. Romans 1 and verse 23. Let's look at that for just a moment. I want to show you a verse there, and then I'll make a point here with what he's trying to say and why I've focused on this section, because I think it's important we talk about that for just a moment. Because we need to know what the temple of God is today, and we need to know these idols and so on, what Paul is trying to reference, okay? In Romans chapter 1, verse 23, listen to what Paul says. He says, and change the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible men and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So what is the image of idolatry here? Well, if you notice what Paul states to the church in Rome, he's talking about what? Man, right? So man is shaping things in the form, look at this, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like what? Corruptible man. All right, now let's go back to our verse here, verse 16. And he says, idols, you are the temple of the living God. So he focuses on idols. The word temple here for just a minute, and I'll give you my explanation. The word for temple here comes from the Greek word naos. It refers to the most holy place, right? So this is where God's presence was manifested over the Ark of the Covenant, right? The most holy place is when the priest would go in once a year, right? And would give the offerings to God. It was the most holy place. And that was for the high priest. Now, it's not related to the more general temple complex or building that we find in the Greek word, which is hieron. Hieron. So there's two different Greek words for temple here, if you will. So since Israel is never identified with the temple, this equation of believers with the most holy place reflects the amazing reality of what? Well, I think part of the point that Paul is trying to make is he's talking about the new covenant with man. He's talking about the new covenant. That is, in which God dwells directly and immediately in the midst of people. That is a reality that's actually inaugurated by his Spirit. Now notice in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 3, clearly you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. So what's the point? So what is the temple of God today? Do what? Church. Yeah. So if it's the new company, now what did you say, Alan? Us. All right. All right. I thought I heard an us in there. That's good. Because the church is us. We are the temple of God, are we not? And so that's part of the point. He says, man has taken things that are incorruptible in God and has molded and shaped them into the corruptible man. They've created, as Paul said here, idols. He said, in what agreement has the temple of God with idols? Paul says none. None, because it's either the incorruptible of God or by God versus the corruptible man. And so man continues to want to try to mold and shape. That's why the church, if you will, or really the best term is religion today, is so far gone. I tell you, and I've said this several times in past, I cannot stand the term religion because it confuses so many different beliefs. It has this idea that, well, I'm a religious person, okay, but what do you believe? And that's when you really get in the meat of it. So anyone can be religious. You can be religious for satanic things. You can be religious atheist. Your belief is something. You may say, well, there is no God, or you may just completely apostate and fall away, but you have a belief system in something. And that is what becomes the corruptible part, or idols, if you will, of man. And so he says, for you are the temple of the living God. And now notice what he says. And this is important right here. I want you to notice this for a second. Let me erase this right here. And then he says, as God has said. Now, this term is familiar. Why is this term familiar? It's an Old Testament reference, right? That's exactly right. So let's think about it this one phrase introduces the entire chain of 6 Old Testament quotes. We're going to notice verses 16 through 18, Paul is going to start quoting from the Old Testament. And he's going to start making references that is essentially to bring their attention to the thought process of the problem. And so he's going to start focusing. So when he says, and God has said, then it should remind you of the phrase, says the Lord Almighty, which is found throughout the Old Testament. So it's with the same power, the same authority that these things are said. And so it is designed to capture the attention of the reader. That's the point. Oh, So that wasn't just Paul. God said that. Our Father in heaven said this. Those are the words of Jesus Christ himself. So it puts that emphasis on it so that we realize these are the words of God and should be given the respect that is due it. So then he says, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, does that sound familiar? He told the Israelites the same thing. In fact, the first quotation is from the covenant formula, comes out of Leviticus. It's Leviticus 26, verses 11 through 12. He says, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Yes, sir. Yes. And and if one chooses sin, you literally, Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2, you have put a separation between you and God. And I believe in that moment, that word may be there, but God does not dwell in that one who chooses, because God cannot dwell where there's sin. And if you choose sin, God is separating himself from you. Yeah. All right, so now with that said, all right, notice here, let me take all my little squigglies away. Turn to Leviticus. I want you to see this. I think this is something that is worth our attention. You can agree with me, disagree with me, that's okay. I'm not going to fall out with you. It's no big deal, but I think Leviticus 26 is going to show us something, and then we can tie it to Ezekiel, a statement that's made by Ezekiel as well. But Leviticus 26, verses 11 and 12. Verses 11 and 12, and I'll just read this part of it. Leviticus 26, 11 and 12. He says, I will walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Now, here we see it adapted how? Well, to the Corinthians, right? In verse 16, by combining it with the new covenant promise. Now, that promise came from, now you can hold your place at Leviticus and go back to 2 Corinthians, okay? Hold your place at Leviticus. And I want you to think about this. Here we see it. Let me rephrase this. Here we see it adapted to the Corinthians by combining it with the new covenant promise of Ezekiel 37. I'll read this one, verse 27. My tabernacle also shall be with them. Indeed, I will be their God, and they shall be my people. What's the difference? So it changes the original from among you to among them. All right, now look at here. He says in verse 16, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. What's it talking about? I'm sorry? Including the Gentiles in that. So what we're looking at is the pending covenant promise, right? From Ezekiel, looking ahead to what is to come, which, yes, is the inclusion of Gentiles. And now Paul is reminding them in Corinth that time has come. So, yeah, I think it does. I think it does. I think it probably goes along with what I'm trying to say, and this is the way I wrote it. This adaptation affirms that the Christian church is experiencing the fulfillment of the covenant promises first given to Israel. So, it's looking to that involvement in that agreement with all of mankind. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying now, Tommy. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't argue with that, but yeah, you could be right about that. All right, verse 17. Verse 17, is that clear as mud? All right, good. As long as it's clear as mud, yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to grab their attention. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and I think that's why he put the emphasis on, and why I kind of pointed it out, as God has said, it's bringing it to their remembrance, bringing it to their thought. Yes, sir. Yep. Yeah. With the same practices, right? Yeah. That's right. That's right. You can't be yoked together, right? You can't do it. You can't have both. And so, absolutely, yeah. And do what? Can't ride the fence, can you? No, absolutely not. Remember, I've always told you, who owns the fence? The devil. That's right. Two of you want it. Who owns the fence? All right, we'll work on that. Everybody's still kind of got the turkey brain, right? I'm not calling you a turkey. I'm saying you ate too much turkey. That's what I'm saying. All right. So let's keeping the same thought. We're going to notice he's going to quote another scripture here in just a moment, verse 17. Let's go ahead and read that. Therefore, he says, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean. And he said, I will receive you. I think here, enjoying God's presence requires what I would call personal holiness, right? By definition, and that's just really for lack of a better phrase, it takes practical application for a child of God to be holy. Now, holy is what, by definition, different, unique, set apart, special, right? And so you're looking at being able to, and I don't want to give it away just yet, to grow in your holiness. Let's talk about it. Paul cited a portion here of Isaiah 52 and also of Ezekiel chapter 20. These are passages that speak of Israel's redemption. In fact, God's people are redeemed from pagan bondage in that period. And he says, come out from them, and he says, be separate, right? So he's talking about come out among them and be separate, be unique, be set apart. So what purpose was that, or what purpose would that serve? Well, in order to be clean before God, you had to touch no unclean thing and thus enjoy fellowship with him. I will receive you. Well, what is that thing which is unclean today? What would you classify unclean? Sin. Sinfulness. Sin is that unclean thing that will cause you to not be able to be received by God or to be in presence of God or anything. In fact, in Galatians, Paul spoke of the bondage of those who are under the obligation of the law. He said in Galatians 3:13 through 14, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in Christ Jesus, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. And then in chapter 4, verse 5, he said to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now, previously or earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul spoke on the same line, the same point in verses 7 through 9. The Corinthian church should have been grateful, and they were not. They should have been grateful that they have a more glorious redemption that's offered to them, but they were not. In fact, Paul wrote to Titus that redemption implied two things. One, deliverance from all wickedness. And two, a purified people who are his very own, eager to do what is good. Titus 2 and verse 14. But they weren't. They weren't, because they were still given to areas of idolatry. So personal purity makes it possible to serve God and be received by him. So the overall, yes, sir, Joe, go ahead. Yeah, that's right. And the separation is that once one is separated, they're working spiritually on being holy or set apart and unique from those things which define them as wicked. And so that's a really good point. We'll pick back up here, actually probably with verse 18 next week. We're right at the end of closed class here. So thank y'all for a really good class, and we'll focus on this again next week. Thank you.